This is Democritus, an ancient Greek philosopher who developed the theory of atoms, and this is Steven Pinker, a Canadian American psychologist studying the ability of speech and language. These two have almost no relation to each other, but I got curious by a thought. What would a Greek philosopher think of modern day psychologist work? What would ancient Greek philosopher Democritus think of Canadian American psychologist Steven Pinker's ideas? And more specifically, this book, How the Mind Works. The book How the Mind Works has many fascinating facets of explanations on brain function. And while this book may be a good read, we do not really need to concern ourselves with the detail of the book. We really only care about its summary. And it goes like this. Through natural selection, the human body designed the mind to be of many components to solve problems and process information. Or in other words, our brain is the product of evolution. But before we can answer this question, we need to decipher the thoughts of a relic long past. We need to know the personality and thoughts of Democritus of Abdera. If you ask a random person off the streets and let's say they humor you, in most cases than not, they will have no idea who Democritus is, even more. So, let's provide some basic details before we continue. Unlike modern science, where once you are in a field of research, be it psychology, physics, or biology, whatever it may be, it usually will be what you will be studying for the rest of your life. But ancient Greek philosophers and many other scientists leading up to the current scientific scene used to study much more than just one disciple of science. As most philosophers after Democritus' time was usually a hybrid of mathematicians and or scientists, on top of just being a philosopher. For example, Aristotle. And unlike the terms we use today, philosophers were basically synonymous with scholars. So here's Democritus of Abdera, a pre-Socratic philosopher who is known primarily for one of the earliest development on the theory of atoms or atomos. Like many philosophers during his time, he was quote-unquote a higher status, which just means he was a noble and of course insanely rich. And like many of his progenitors, he traveled the ancient world to learn of its secrets and knowledge. He was one of the very first people to embrace the idea of imperialism, as his theories rely heavily on senses needing an external input. And while he existed at least 2,000 years before the acceptance of the atomic theory, he was more akin to a contemporary scientist than that of a philosopher. He was not really known to many people, nor did he seek out fame, with sources pointing out he rather kept to himself. But those sources may be dubious at best. For example, the website geniuses.club. And among his contemporaries, he was known as the laughing philosopher due to either his eccentric and comical nature or in interpretations in later writings, laughing at the people when they do something really dumb. I guess he was just a really silly guy. Even though his development of the theory of atoms was extraordinary, his philosophy and his beliefs were not as exciting, but still something worth mentioning. His philosophy was the concept of pursuing eudaimonia, the idea that fulfillment and happiness comes from the balancing of the mind, the idea to pursue tranquility. And a modern interpretation of this idea is the maintenance of mental health. which I guess makes sense in hindsight, as he was called the laughing philosopher. Now that we know a little about Democritus, let us focus on his theories of the world. To understand many of his ideas, we'll have to start at the theory of Adam. The concept of Adam first began with Parmenides' challenge, or more so his hypothesis, which goes like this. We can speak and think of what exists, and what exists is uncreated, imperishable, for it is whole and unchanging and complete. It is not or nor shall be different, since it is now all at once, one and continuous. Parmenides establishes the idea that everything in the universe is one object, one idea, one you. And the ground that you're standing on, the water you drink, and specifically the perceived changes of your environment is a simple illusion that something is happening. Immediately, we can see that there is something very wrong with this theory. If everything is an illusion, why can't we not shape the illusion to how we see fit? Or how there are individuals that have completely different thoughts, bodies completely separate from you. Because of this contradiction, another theory was propagated, the theory of atoms. This early theory of atoms may sound familiar to some, as it is these two concepts created reality as a way to explain the necessity of a changing world. He claimed that as something observed grows and changes, it is evidence that these particles are rearranging and colliding with themselves to create what you see in front of your eyes. There are more to this theory of atoms proposed by Democritus. For example, this model could only be used to explain the current observed world, the world 400 BCE, and does not account for future discoveries such as the vacuum of space, the required energy to move an atom, nor the weight of an atom. But all we care about at this point would be the idea that, against Parmenides' theory, Democritus believed the world is made of atoms that come together to form a higher function. But this is not all to his theory. While he is mostly known for his development of the theory on atoms, Democritus was also a theorist on perception. There, he explored the idea of how information is transferred from the body to the mind. While not very accurate or useful as his theory of atoms, he utilizes the theory of atoms to explain perception. As stated earlier, the buildup of atoms results in the creation of structures. As an example, building walls, we can see that the walls are being built, which shows change and growth. But how does that specifically apply to our perception of receiving that information? To Democritus stated that in order for you to be aware of change, a person would need to come into contact with the atom to perceive whatever it was they needed to see. They would need the physical atom to enter what we know today as the pupil. Now, as a person of common sense, you and I both know that this theory does not make any sense at all, as you do not need to have water splash in your face to know that there's water in a lake. You can simply see it. But again, we do not care if the theory is rejected or accepted. We do care for the idea of specific atoms performing specific functions. Now that we have a majority of the foundation laid, it's time to talk about Democritus' opinion on Pinker. Now that we explored the mind of Democritus, his theories of atoms, perception, and the pursuit of mental balance, we can finally return to our original question. What would Democritus think about Steven Pinker and his book, How the Mind Works? As mentioned at the start, the core concept of the book, How the Mind Works, is that natural selection shaped the mind into a set of specialized components for solving problems and processing information efficiently. With our interpretation of Democritus's thought, we could conclude that he would agree with the premise that the mind is made of specialized components whose main function is to process information. We have seen this idea repeated over and over again in his theory of the atoms, that the universe is made up of particles that have different shapes and utility that build upon each other to form the perception of your mind. This was also demonstrated in his branching theory of perception, as we can see how Democritus describes the atom that receives input from others as sensory modules. We can see almost the parallels between these two concepts. Both propose how parts are being added to an object until eventually it forms a complete system. While we could definitively confirm that Democritus would agree with the idea that the mind being a system of organs, we could not say the same about his belief that the mind was created through evolution. Democritus believed in a universe governed by necessity, with atoms moving in a void according to natural laws. However, the absence of knowledge on natural selection or any evolution theories inhibits his understanding of the natural world. He is limited by the fact that such information will not be known to him for the next 1500 years. In the end, we couldn't get a clear answer on this specific question from Democritus, but I think if he were to pick up the book How the Mind Works, he might laugh, not out of mockery, but recognition. He would see a modern echo of his principles, a world made of parts, systems, and natural laws. He may not grasp Darwinian evolution, but he would likely respect the exploratory power of such a theory, even only as a modern form of his own belief. In the end, he would laugh at the irony of those who are so much like him, would contradict him so much.